are the chess traps? Now, first thing I want to tell you is that when it comes down to traps in chess, you need to realize, you need to understand that in most times it's about really one thing. Setting up a position which the opponent has a very nice looking line, which could possibly help him even to win some material. And then suddenly you realize, hey, he doesn't actually have that. You know, thing is that he may not realize it in time, and this may give you the opportunity to be very successful. What we're going to look at right now is one of the most famous examples. A game that was played between Krejcik and Butma Baumgartner in Tropo 1914, where White basically started with e4, e5, knight f3, bishop c5. Now, this smells like a trap. As you could say it, I mean, we just, it's hard to believe that the opponent will just jump in with the bishop like that unless he's actually got something in mind. Indeed, it is a pretty big move. But what exactly is it? Why is he letting us to attack like that and do different type of things? It's a pretty important question. To actually answer that type of question, you need to remember to look. And look at two things. First thing, you need to be looking at your own weaknesses. Where are you weak? Where can the opponent threaten or attack you? When you get to think a little bit more about that, it will help you greatly because you will realize the real difference at the different attacks that you could make and eventually what you have to do to avoid them. Like in this specific position, White could do knight x to the e5. But then again, you might look and not yet find anything that special. Like, what's really going on here? It doesn't feel like we have to worry all that much about the threats. White's able to play with knight x to the e5. You can then go for a move like d4. I mean, come on, this is only going to be there for a short while. But when once we counter the bishop, the attack is over. It looks like it. So White had a pretty good idea to believe that this is fake. So what happened, really? Was it fake, or perhaps he got himself into trouble? This is a really great question to think about. So let's see. Let's actually take a look and realize what happened. As White continued with this one move, the next move by Black was very important, and he immediately played along the candidate of, it's actually pretty big, so let me tell you. After knight x to the e5, Black played bishop takes f2 check. These are the kinds of first moves that you always want to begin thinking about. What are the opponent's most forcing moves in the position? Checks, captures, direct threats, any kinds of moves like that must be considered first to begin with. Because when we get to think about those type of moves, we'll know exactly what the dangers are and ultimately what you've got to stay away from. Bishop takes f2. Now, we still don't know if this is really a dangerous move. So you got to be thinking about this even before you make knight x to the e5. Here, queen h4 check, g3, and queen takes to the e4. So that almost looks like Black actually got a couple pawns. He's attacking. Of course, however, there's knight f3. So we could realize that this was a sort of fake trap. Black's tactic does not work, and apparently White must be winning in this position. So that was pretty badly played by Black, right? Yeah, but White, it looks like White almost misplayed it. He did queen e2. So now, all of a sudden, Black feels that joy. The thing that he couldn't have earlier suddenly becomes possible. Suddenly he has the chance to win the rook back, and he grabs it quickly. Now what you got to understand is that when the opponent's offering you something so big, you need to think, at least in terms of why. Again, most of the moves that our opponent can play are not at all that important. So you really don't have to be that worried or afraid of those. But the moves you've got to be thinking about are the kinds of moves with which we could pressure an attack or threaten in one way or another. And the truth is that in that specific position, all that white wants to do in here is basically come up with a move of queen takes h1, bishop g2, queen takes, and knight f3. A discovered attack which practically kills black as it wins the queen. See, people get so excited about the possibility that a sacrifice, or not so much of a sacrifice, like a blunder, they think it's a blunder at least, that the opponent made could give them, that they forget. They forget to think about their own weaknesses, about their own vulnerabilities, about the challenges that the opponent's probably going to set up in response to the obvious win that we're able to get in a position like that. This is why it is so needed to think about those kinds of moves and at least be ready, at least prepare ourselves for whatever is going to happen. Very interesting idea. So what were the 3 rules is, number 1, remember to look carefully and look at your own weaknesses. Think about the opponent's forcing moves and possibilities, because those will likely be the ones that you have to worry about or you have to care about. Secondly, calculate them precisely. Not all traps of that kind are going to always work. You just want to be aware. And more importantly, as you could see it in this type of position, the most valuable point was the fact that after bishop takes f in the sacrifice, white set up a trap on his own, which this time worked out really great, given that black couldn't take h1. Yet black was so excited that he could take the rook. Not that he could do much more, but still, it was a pretty sweet looking trap. So we could see the comparison between a good, correct, and an incorrect one. Now let's take a look at another interesting trap that happened in a game that was played in the 17th century. It's an old game, but this trap can appear in many others. What we're talking about is a line when white played knight f3, then black played knight c6, and now white does bishop to the c4. So essentially this is the Italian game, and white's idea is to, of course, occupy some of the best squares around the middle and play off of those, whether it's going to be in search for an attack against the black king or just in the possibility to open up the position. It really doesn't matter so much as long as it could help and advance here. This was great. So what comes out next, actually, in this position? Well, after that was played very quickly, bishop to c4 is a really nice move. Now black has to make a decision how to advance, so he actually picked up to do the move of bishop c5, c3, knight f6, and d4. Now, see, this is not a very specific type of trap, like white is making this or playing that type of direction just so that he could set up the trap. It's what I would call a natural trap. A natural trap means that you're naturally setting up, like the trapping line, without actually having to create any vulnerabilities to your position, without actually having to make anything bad. And that's quite good here, because we see the resource that's being created. As white plays it just like that, we see that the first thing that's out there is the idea that he will be controlling a lot of space in the middle. But then there is also a lot of other moves that can happen, like when white develops his own bishop, he can go from there, he could attack the bishop, he can attack the black knight, focus on pressuring towards the center. It's a really great way to go. So, this was very interesting. Now what comes out next is also just as interesting, because black played bishop b6, and see, to avoid this trap, to avoid traps, it's not that difficult. You just need to remember a couple of simple rules that will help you to be very successful. Okay, so there are a couple of things really, you just need to know them. The first thing being, you want to simplify. You really don't want to be thinking about big tactics or whatever. You just want to be able to simplify the position. And if black did go for that, Like if you did think about a way to simplify, next move after c takes to the d, you could play bishop b4 check here, maybe even knight takes to the e4, and shortly after that things were going to be quite good. Just this is quite easy, quite simple to follow up in that position. No need to worry about. So very, very interesting. So what happened in the game? What didn't work? Well, the truth being is that just obviously with that kind of check in mind, with that kind of capture, it's very good for black. But he didn't do it. He played the bishop to the b6 move, hoping that this will help him to solidify, keep everything under control, and most likely that would be a good idea. Why not? After all, makes a good sense to do that. So what does white do? It's an interesting question. Well, he plays d takes to the e5. Now, black's prepared against this. As you could see, he's ready. He is allowing us to capture him there, because then when we get to capture, of course, what he would like to do is going to be to continue with the move of knight takes to the e4, and it almost looks great. He's able to do this. He's having a good challenge versus us, so why not? It's a great, simple move to deliver things well. Now, what do we do here? Great question. When that last move really happened, all that white was looking to do was to make the move queen to the d5. And suddenly we realize the danger of this. See, the danger being is that as soon as we capture it, we're actually having the possibility to follow up against the f7, and then we have the attack against the e4 knight. So it's really powerful. It's great. It's dangerous for black to stay against it, and yet he has nothing else to do. One of the things is looking at complications in such a manner is actually pretty interesting. Most people do not believe that complications are anything dangerous, because they say, okay, if I may not be developed, but my opponent is not that developed too, so what's the problem? Simple. The problem is that when you do not have that proper control, when you do not have the development being made, then you can't quite deliver a whole lot more. You're always going to be at a disadvantage, and you're always going to have more things to worry about. So that's the issue for black. He was not ready, and so when the queen comes up to the d5 square, we see that there's the knight or the checkmate. Either one of those is going to fall. So black loses. The key lessons from this trap we understand is the first lesson: don't run too quickly like this. Exchange, simplify. You could still run, but you like to think, what could be the possible follow-up by the opponent? Oftentimes he's not going to have a follow-up, but you cannot know that. So you have to keep going. Like a little exchange and the bishop to the b4 as a check would have done a great job for black. It would have helped him to immediately simplify the position, possibly get to capture the pawn on e4 as it would happen, and maybe then focus on d5 or similar moves to confront white. It would have been rather easy, I have to say, not like this. The other important thing that mattered, when it came to the position after d4, is that after bishop to e6, black made a calculation, thinking that when white's tactics go, black will have just enough so that he can confront that activity. That was completely untrue. You can defend or ever oppose an upcoming set of pieces, well coordinated and relevant, with just a couple of yours. See, it requires a lot more. And whenever a collision of that kind really happens, then one loses. The player who is more behind or more backward in terms of development is always going to lose it. Always, every single time. That's the reason why it turns out so successful for white after he just captures the pawn on the e5 and is ready to follow with knight to the queen to the d5. It was great, well played, and fairly beautiful. Let's take a look at another interesting trap and example on how that works. Now, what about black? Could black set up some threats and deliver a combination on his own? Let's take a look at a game that was played between Gibbot and Lazard in 1924. This was a very interesting one. Basically, white started with d4, knight f6. And then there was the move of knight to the d2. I wouldn't say that this was necessarily one of the most perfect moves, but it had an interesting idea. It had a good thought to it. Essentially, what white wanted to do was just to make sure that he gets the, a quick sequence here. It worked to an extent. Black plays e5. Now, of course, white chooses to capture so that he could take. And then after knight g4, now he could have played knight f3, but then suddenly he realizes, you know what, knight f3 is not going to do all that much because either way he will likely take my pawn. So let's just do h3. Let's challenge it, and as I get to challenge him further, things can go pretty well, right? Yeah, that was almost right. With the only difference that it's not. You see, h3 loses pretty much immediately, and the reason why it does is because black could now continue with the move of knight e3. Point being is that as soon as the knight simply stands up there, there is nothing that he will be able to do in order to make a difference. An amazing move. These kinds of traps do exist because of the opponent not realizing the power of the advanced pieces. A lot of times, people will not realize the power of the advanced or capable pieces until it's too late. And now it is a little bit too late. As the position of the of the piece goes on, we understand the power of this really coming through. The f takes to d is impossible, and otherwise he will just lose the queen with no practical chance to escape. Brilliant example of what it means to underestimate your opponent's active pieces. Now, what else? What other traps I can show you? Oh, here's another. This was a game played between Selman and Warren, in which basically white started with d4, knight f6, c4, and e5, the so-called Budapest. It's not a very common opening because it's not considered that correct. Yet white did misplay it terribly. He actually went on with moves like a3, which were really bad, as you could see very easily why. And then black played d6. Yeah. Once again, the kind of activity that black was getting and the resources from that are most relevant. And in a position of this kind, it's all we care about. So black was getting ready to open up, exchange, and give his pieces the chance to attack very quickly. So what comes out next? After the move of d6, seeing that the pawn is attacked, white captures, bishop takes d, and then he decided to make it perfect with g3. Yet he forgot the most important thing that matters. In such a position, the most important thing that really matters is what I would call the overall structure. If you look at the overall structure of white, you realize that there is almost none. The only moves that he was able to do from the very beginning were pawn moves. So how could a position grow and get better when only pawns are being moved forward and advanced? It can't. So would you care to think a little bit about this and try to figure out what's black's best move to challenge or exploit the mistake of white? Well, apparently, the only thing that black has to do is knight takes f2. That exposes the king, and also what it does very beautifully is that it's actually going to force him to move down to f2, so he has to capture, and then after the capture is being done, we realize that there's going to be a great bishop takes the g, which really kills off everything that black was hoping for. It's a great move. King takes f, then bishop takes the g3. There's no way on how white can escape. And then more importantly, we have this attack out there against the queen, against the king, and against everything else. Very amazing. Oftentimes, that's what you've got to be in this type of position. Is you have to be more forcing with everything you've got. It was good, it was beautiful, and it was effective all the way. So let's see. All these traps are because Somebody leaves an actual weakness, and he allows the opponent to come forward and create enough threats. Then, of course, this is how it happens. It's very dangerous, and it works out quite beautifully as black made it. Let's take a look now at another interesting example so we could see what it's all about. When you least expect it, in fact, this is very important. Here's an example. That's one of my favorite traps, and I have to tell you, it kind of brought a memory when I failed to that myself. This is a trap which nobody would expect, and it's really sad when it happens to you, but I'm sure that everybody has experienced it at least once in their games. It's basically when white plays d4. Now, I didn't experience it in that exact order, but it's very similar. The pawn takes d4, and then essentially white plays knight f3. And when I was playing it with white, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to take the pawn on d4 next move. And so it really looks good. And it does look kind of good. Trouble is, it doesn't. Black gets to play e5 in this position very strongly, and then we could understand the reason why that's so good. After the move of e5, white can't capture the pawn back. This is very beautiful. The pawn cannot be taken. Why? And the moment white takes it, black's got to play queen e5 check. So suddenly we realize that's actually pretty nasty. As if the bishop comes up, we just get to capture on the e5 ad there. And you see, this is really, really important ad there. And so, in fact, actually, this is great. Bishop d2, queen takes d5, we got knight f6, we get this attack. It's pretty strong and surely winning as it comes out. Very interesting idea about these positions is the concept of strength. How do you do that in a position of that kind? How do you apply the power, the strength? It's greatly played because, for the most part, e5 really cuts off the majority of white's possibilities. And it does that very effectively through a great support on the center. Really, really good. Traps like that exist in every opening, and they don't necessarily need to be like very special or very attacking, very threatening. Let's take a look at another example that I like to show you, which is a very interesting one about the traps that could exist even in the most mundane type of position. You're going to go with white this time, and this was basically e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight d7, and bishop c4. So white's really setting up to improve his bishop. He's getting it to a place where it's pretty stable, pretty solid. So it looks good. Now what's happening after that, very importantly, is the danger. Now what kind of danger am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that the moment, this very next moment, where white plays this bishop on the c4, we understand that black's very passive. Now, being passive in a position of this kind could become very scary. But what's going on next? Well, black plays bishop e7. Now, of course, he does that because in case of knight f6, there could be knight g5 hitting the f7 and challenging through in a very dangerous way. So he could play bishop e7 in order to step forward and solidify. So this is great. This is important to discuss. What is white supposed to do in this position? D takes d, d takes d, and hell, queen d5. Amazing, attacking both here, over here, and over here. If black plays with knight x to the e5, we have something very similar, going with the trade and then the opportunity to play along this move. It's beautiful to understand why that tactic really works, but it does work because black is perfectly well set up and prepared to deliver it. the opening of the position always helps the player who is most, well situated. And the reality is that there was very little that black could do. Even in case of g6, there could have been the move of queen takes to the e5. That's really strong and brilliant. Queen to f, like knight to the f6, bishop to the h6 is a good idea. We get bishop to the g7 in that type of position, and it's really, really strong, really interesting to follow. So the whole concept always has to do with pressure. When black played d takes d, there's queen d5. See, when you're having a good piece activity, that could help you brilliantly within the different tactics and possibilities you're looking for. Yes, it does take some time, and yes, it's not that easy to do that, but this is ultimately what we're looking for. In that specific position now, it works out perfect for white, and he gets the ability to advance. So it was great. Very excellent in terms of setup and possibilities to go by. So let's now take a look at another interesting trap I would like to show you so you could see a little bit more about how it's done so you could be more successful. Finally, I'd like to show you one very similar trap existing in that kind of setup. And what I'm talking about is after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, as white plays d4, knight d7, bishop d6. Now up here, a lot of people play c6 so that they could defend very well. That's a pretty decent candidate. Defending, keeping everything protected. It makes sense to do that. Now, the moment it happens, essentially white could do castle, knight f6, and of course the idea behind it is that we just get to play very quickly with the move of knight c3. Now, when the knight comes to c3, a lot of people would just go bishop e7 and they would feel pretty nice about it. And it's true, indeed. Now, it's interesting to see the possibility for a trap. Let's see white plays a4 in this moment. And black now goes with something like, say, the move of, maybe he could try. Castling is the most logical idea, but, let's imagine he plays a different kind of move, say e takes to the d. E takes to the d, of course, doesn't work because of knight takes to the d that would take control. But, for instance, say queen c7 will be met by a5, that will limit black's position. So maybe he could try a move like h6. And again, I think most people would not really get to like or love this type of position. So say he plays this, queen e2, and queen c7. Now, this is really interesting as a move, because it almost feels like black is set up to advance or counter in the queen side, and he does it fairly nice, fairly well. So what is white's strategy to oppose against this? His strategy is everything to do with bishop knight g5. And that knight at the g5, which really comes forward, helps out because after black castles, white can do bishop takes f7. Now rook takes f7 and queen c4. As I mentioned earlier, it is so important to get the pieces properly advanced that once they're there, once they're so strong, it takes almost no time to get them beautifully into the attack and make this destructive. The knight is attacking now, the pressure is there, and most of black's actual pieces feel like they can't go anywhere, because the rook is being threatened and everything else feels like it's going down. One of the most exciting ideas about such moves, about such positions, is to get to utilize your strong and active pieces. And if you think about the opponent, you've got to be thinking about how he is going to try and, respond that. If he doesn't, you can use your pieces successfully. In that particular case, white is great with that. He's got all the different tactics, and the success is easy. So that's all I have to say about this game. A pretty interesting one. And these are some of the traps that you could set. And then you also want to be thinking about how to avoid them when it comes to you. Simply by asking yourself the question, what is the danger? Like, what will be the kind of tactics or different shots that maybe my opponent will attempt, so I could eventually stay away from this. Be careful about the advanced pieces, and more importantly, think precisely about the different tactics that your opponent might utilize. These are my major thoughts on the concept of traps.